Hey, Adam, welcome along to effectively your exhibition. Actually, in the gallery, you're in your studio in South Gippsland, and the exhibition, which has been a tremendous success up here, where some find peace. It's an extraordinary body of work, and it's something that you've been working on for over 3 years now. Can you just explain a little bit about where the ideas have come together for this exhibition?
Yes. Well, they are in a certain degree a continuation of themes that I have explored previously and have been developing. Themes of identity, isolation, colonisation, migration. Whereas in this body of work, some of those themes have become extremely sharpened, when there's notable sort of focal points and duality of motifs being used in the works, and in particular, some of the motifs take the form of petroglyphs within the rocks, which represent our First Nations people, and it's an acknowledgement of by myself, but it's also a reflection of that lack of history that we were taught of our generation, and that re-establishment of what forms our identity and how we are interconnected in that regard as Australians.
Okay, so when we're talking about motifs, one of the things about your work over a couple of decades now is you're using the landscape, but then placing structures and objects, and now, as you're saying, hidden or loosely camouflaged motifs into the landscape themselves. So some of these structures and motifs, they point directly to your thematic base.
Yes, they do. Absolutely, they are the narrative within the works, and the reason and the works are constructed around that narrative or that message. The message isn't meant to be, for want of a word, it's not meant to be bombastic. It's meant to be a subtle backdrop within the work for people to discover or read for themselves, and read the symbols and the motifs in a manner in which makes sense to them. There is no dedicated idea that someone should stand in front of one of these pieces and go, "Oh, I get what he's trying to tell me." It's about,
so it's not jamming down your throat sort of situation.
No, it's yeah, absolutely. It's got nothing to do with preaching. It's got nothing to do with telling people what to think or do. It's about my position is in terms of the narrative that I'm imbuing the works to be, that are significant to me, but it's also important to me that the works are open-ended, that someone can come along and look and read through and find these things and discover and find those things for themselves and make their own determinations of what they represent in their own visual sense.
It's interesting with the structures. They do vary from almost totemic, whether they be almost like staffs, Roman staffs, through to stairway to bell towers. And in this exhibition, there's been a move into the sea mines that were used, I think, in World War I, World War II. So on the one hand, you have the navigational structures, which have been painted and worked on, which I've always viewed them as a sort of way that people are guided into a safe haven. And then now you've introduced these naval mines, both in the paintings and also the sculptures. What's the situation with that? Because that really changes the conversation from perhaps a sense of hope, but these seem to be more warning bells, for want of a better term. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, well, it is a fair comment from the immediate response of looking at those sea mines. They connote a certain notion of war, of death, of destruction. For me, I see them in a dualistic sort of way. Yes, they have that element to them, but they also have that other element to them, whereas they are deposed within the landscape. They are discards of times which we thought we'd not see again in our lifetimes, but obviously given Mr. Putin and what's happening in the Ukraine recently, we can see that humanity has fallen back and will continue to fall back potentially into those same sorts of vices, where such weapons of indiscriminate destruction are once again deployed against groups of people innocently, or not so innocently. So they are reminders of that potential. And in the context that I've placed them within the Australian landscape, they are also reminders of the way that Australia as a country was settled and taken by force, taken by non-choice. So there are those subtle overlays within those, but also they reflect my personal narrative, my personal family history of being Holocaust survivors. So they're remnants of that, and of my generation. We have all had that baggage that sits in the background, and they are the reminders of times which, although would seem so distant to some, are still only quite fresh in others. So
it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because the art becomes one of the great things about art through history, and the role of the artist in history is to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, point to social issues and things within society that either need to be celebrated or changed. And I think there's an interesting thing that happens with both your paintings and the sculptural forms, is that there is beauty even in the face of some of these pretty tough conversations you're having. And I mean, when it comes to the sculptures, the patina, which is, you know, one of my favourite things about things aging, and it takes on a sense of history. But your paintings, one can look at them and you know, the layers of subject matter that you're delving into can be recognised, but you can also look across the paintings and just feel a sense of calmness or some sense of awe around the landscape which you painted, and that has a really strong historical basis for you. I know that you've been a great sort of student of landscape painting, which goes back hundreds of years. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your influences from a landscape point of view?
Well, definitely. The landscape genre is a relatively new individual genre of painting. It once formed the backdrop, almost like a curtain to portraiture.
Like a stage set or something like that.
Like a stage set. And yeah. It was only, you know, during the golden period of Dutch painting, with people such as Ruysdael, who started painting the landscape as a real theme, as an image of content, which was beyond just depicting somebody's farm. And from that sort of point, you started to see that Ruysdael would include small figures overwhelmed within the landscape, or awed by the landscape, almost in a sublime sort of way, hinting at the beginning of the sublime. The landscape in that generation of artists becomes the preeminent motif or icon.
So the way the artist would present the work, so things like the sky, or the general atmosphere of the painting being dark and brooding, would lean it one way or another. And you mentioned about the scale of the figures. What was that about in relation to the landscape?
Yeah, well, you know, from an art historical term, there's different ideas, but my personal view when I've looked at these works and keep looking at these works is that I can't help but think that that say Rusedale and followers on from there on were looking at the not only the wonder of the landscape, but also the human place within the landscape and the scale, meaning that the land is everything. The land is bigger than us. The heavens, the terrestrial, the celestial is above and under us and around us, and we are all only just but players within that stage. So as opposed to the if you think of like the Gainsborough portraits, where the figure is the paramount central motif and is the owner of the land, is the dominant force within those pictures, is the central motif. Whereas these Rusedale pictures and the ones that follow through to the Casperdeva Friedrich pictures are the human forms are very small and are overwhelmed within these tumultuous or often beautiful landscapes, and are just small bit part players. They don't own the land, they don't run the land, they are just part of the creation, the wider creation.
It is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because when you look at it, this sort of sense of another force, we can call it religion, we can call it, in First Nations, the dreaming. It really cuts across all forms of human emotion in relation to their sense of place. And just with people like Rusedale, or artists like Rusedale, the way they constructed paintings has been something that you've really, I always use the sense or the term with your work, but it's almost like there's a sense of craft in the way that you build out the paintings. So, for instance, the two works behind me, it's a very difficult thing to see on the Zoom screen, but there's this luminosity and sense, and it's on something that you can just come along to the canvas and slap a bit of paint on and get that sense of glowing, sunset or sunrise or whatever, and the interplay with light on water. Can you give us a few clues about how you go about constructing these works?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I'm most proud about and take my greatest pride in is in the development of the technical abilities within these works. The works are made in a very you can call it a classical technique, but it's not really. It's really it was created during that golden era of the Dutch painters, and what it really involves is that the paintings are made over multiple layers, very thin veils of paint. So very, very loosely, what happens with that is that the light, as an optical thing, penetrates through those layers, refracts, hits the back of the canvas, which will often have a particular colour leading toward the temperature within the works, and then refract back out towards the human eye. And what happens is that creates that sense of depth, but also creates that sense of luminosity, because the light just isn't just hitting one fractal surface, refracting surface. It's penetrating through up to sometimes 40 or 50 layers. And in particular, that painting over your left shoulder there would easily have up to 60 or 70 layers within that painting. And to see that work in the flesh, you could almost stick your finger into the atmosphere of that sky. It's heavy, it's viscous, and that's not something you can create from just one or two layers of paint. You can make a facsimile of that, but it's not really. It's a simulation, whereas these having so many layers, it's almost like a sculptural depth. So you're almost looking like at a three-dimensional surface, even though it appears on a two-dimensional scale.
It is quite extraordinary, and you've actually go to the extent of making your own paint pigment. Is that right? You're still mixing various.
Yeah. Yep. I still utilise there was a very, very intelligent and very wonderful man, eccentric. His name was Edel Marcus, and I was lucky to meet him when I was at Victorian College of the Arts as a very young art student. And Phil Hunter, one of Australia's great painters, introduced me to him. And Ed Marcus made a series of paints that he wanted to return the skill of painting back to where it was. So basically, he made these tubes of paint which were 99.9% pure pigment, already ground, and they allowed the artist to choose the amount of pigment that would go into their paint, and then you'd use mediums to mix in with them. Whereas opposed to a tube you buy off the shelf now, which is full of wax and fillers, would be, in some cases, we'd be lucky to have even 1% pigment in them.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely right.
So that helps the luminosity, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. It helps the luminosity. It also helps the color as well, because the colors, the pigments that Ed developed and chose were all AAA light fast pigments. So that means they won't fade from sunlight. They don't brown. They don't yellow. They don't change. They are light fast pigments, and amazingly, they are the same pigments in their purest forms as what was used by Rembrandt and Ruysdael and the Italian. It's very much based on that technique. The only difference is that I don't grind my own pigments. The pigments were already ground for me and placed into tubes. So
with that, just going back to the landscape that you paint, the history of landscape and landscape painting. You mentioned about how it originally started as a backdrop for whatever was being performed in the foreground, and then became something in its own right. But when we're talking about people like Frederick Church and Ruysdael, Turner, these artists didn't necessarily just go out and paint a view. They would reconstruct it, reposition it for either dramatic effect or for compositional harmony. Your paintings, correct me if I'm wrong, but have an influence from where you live, looking down on Wilson's Prom, Tasmania, west coast of Australia. You're taking experiences and drawings from your travels. Is that the way you go about constructing these works?
Yeah, absolutely. That's spot on. Every work that's made will have references a particular place that I've seen or a locale. And then back in the studio, I reconstruct those to suit my own artistic output. So a work like the one over your left shoulder there is from the Bay of Fires in East Coast Tasmania. You obviously wouldn't find that totemic stone there, but it's fairly close to what you'd actually find there. Give or take a few things. And the painting to your right shoulder is based from a place in Point Anne in WA. And once again, it's a reconstruction back in my studio. So the paintings will always generally reference a particular location, but they'd be maybe 60, 70% representational of an actual place.
But so, then you can change the atmosphere by the sky and
and then artistic license takes its point from there, and the works develop to have their own sense of space, their own sense of light, their own sense of structure.
So go on.
Yes. No, I was just going to say that process within itself, I've tried to articulate it before, but it's that trying to sound wanky. It's something that's guided from outside and inside me, that I'm driven. these works end up being what they end up being, not because I've started off with some absolute predetermined dogmatic idea. Right. I end up evolving into the finished works they do now. I start off with initial ideas, and the paintings as they're being made and the drawings for the paintings give me compositional ideas and so forth. But quite often now, these paintings evolve as they're traveling through the process of being made. And just like anything in life, when you have 2 or 3 years to ponder and reconsider and postulate over something you're looking at, your ideas and your views change of things, and that's particularly, I think, unlike any other body of work that I've made previously, this body of work has definitely been made in that sort of state of flux. And given what we've had surrounding us in terms of COVID and other global issues, those influences have come into those works as well.
It's interesting with your bodies of work or series. It's almost, and I've said this in the past, that the last few paintings often indicate where things are traveling in the future, and it's but the whole all the work over the last 20 odd years that I've been watching your painting has a similarity about it, has a similarity of idea or base idea. I mean, it's always pretty well always got the landscape involved in some form of structure within that. Tell me, just when it comes to the landscape, there's generally speaking a very strong delineation of a horizon line and a structure within the paintings. Can you tell me a little bit about that from a compositional point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak about that in 2 ways. The horizon line is, in particular for landscape painting, is something that is historically reflective of where you can often find where the paintings have been made by looking at the horizon lines. For argument's sake, when you're looking at some of those Dutch paintings made in the 1600s, you always see these very, very low horizon lines, huge skies reflecting the lowlands. And you even if you move forward a couple of 100 years at the Caspar David Friedrich paintings, you see these low horizon lines, which once again reflect the low-lying areas of Northern Europe. And it becomes the same when you're looking at works by Turner as well. Turner's talking about a sublime, but he's still working at the low horizon line. So there's that component to it. And then from my perspective, I'm also looking at the abstract qualities within those horizon lines. So these works themselves, I know you may not be able to see them directly as you look at them, but they're also influenced by painters like Rothko and Barnett Newman, and the abstract structure of shape and line, and take out the landscape elements and look at them as colour fields, and you can sort of see that lineage as well.
There's also that shimmering quality about how the light moves between each, for want of a better term, section of a painting. It's funny you mentioned Rothko, because I was sort of wandering around the show the other day, and I was thinking about that, almost compartmentalizing the paintings and saying, I wonder what these would be like without any sort of sense of realism. And just speaking about the realist nature, I always find that really strong realist paintings or surrealist paintings, whatever you want to talk about, the quality of the work or the standard of the work is always lifted in a painting sense when there is a sense of a quality of painting about them, that they're not slavishly sticking to a photographic sense, or which interests me almost not at all. So one of the things about this show is that there is a this exquisite sort of flow, almost meditative quality to the works. So the clouds come in and out of your understanding when you're looking at the works. Very subtle, and I think when you're talking about the development of your visual language, it's been something that is definitely developed over the last 10 years. And every exhibition, I think, oh, how much better can he get at this? And I think this has been an extraordinary body of work that has come together. And I'm really excited about the three-dimensional quality, the sculptural forms that are coming into it too, because the relationship between the paintings and the sculptures are, quite profound, and both speak to each other really strongly. So from this point, the next step for you is staying in the studio and working away. I would imagine another trip's on the horizon for you as soon as you can.
Yeah. As soon as we're allowed to travel, and it's going to be safe to travel. Yeah, that's been paramount in my studio work. Those trips, traveling every year for a couple of months to different locations, recharging my views, time to ruminate on ideas. Yeah, very important to keeping the work fresh, and very important that I need to be able to spend time in the landscape because whilst these works behind you in the exhibitions, you're right, they are realist works, but they're not about a photographic realism. They're not about a photographic documentation. They're constructs, and they're paintings. And when you look at them on initial first look at them, yes, they have a realistic representation, but the more you look at them, the more it's like reading a piece of Vikram Seth literature. It's about reality, but it's not about reality. It's about another extension. It's about that trip in between when you've driven from one point to another and wonder how you've got there, and you don't remember doing it.
I think, and for me, I suppose it's a nice moment to finish our conversation. But it's really the thing about your paintings, and the thing about the paintings in this exhibition is that they are works that reveal themselves over time, and you do have the ability to get lost in them. And by going on that journey into the paintings, and then finally discovering little elements that you've put there to reward the person who's willing to take the time to spend time looking at pictures or your picture, I think is a really exciting thing. And it's also something that's quite important in today's age, where everything is very fast, and we look at images in a split second, and you make assumptions about things, and it perhaps the slowing down of the creation of the work, and the slowing down of the thinking deeply about various themes that roll into the work is a very important thing for a broad audience to take on board. So I just from all of us here, congratulations on a beautiful body of work, and we're already looking forward to the next instalment. Hopefully it's not 3 years' time, but it's all very exciting.